If you look at the US debt clock right now, you'll see a number that feels unreal. $36 trillion. Still rising every second. Most people assume this means America will eventually have to pay it back. Higher taxes, spending cuts, or a dramatic default. But that's not what's actually happening. The truth is far stranger and far more dangerous. The United States is paying its debt. Just not in the way you think. To understand what's happening, you first need to understand the scale. The U.S. national debt is now racing past $36 trillion, heading toward $38 trillion. To put that into perspective, if you stacked $1 bills on top of each other, the pile wouldn't just reach the moon, it would go past it. For decades, politicians waved this away. Deficits don't matter. We owe the money to ourselves. As long as the economy grows, it's fine. The debt became a scoreboard. Scary looking, but harmless. That illusion ended in 2024. For the first time in American history, the U.S. government now spends more on interest payments than on national defense. More than the military, more than Medicaid. Nearly $1 trillion a year, just to service old debt. This is where the system breaks, because unlike a household, the U.S. government cannot simply cut spending. Social Security, Medicare, these are political promises to an aging population. They can't be touched. So instead of paying down debt, the government issues new debt to pay the interest on the old debt. A new credit card to pay the minimum balance on the last one. This creates something called a debt spiral. More debt, more interest, more interest, more borrowing, even more debt. It's not linear, it's exponential. And here's the terrifying part. There is no traditional way out of a debt burden this large. Historically, countries only escape debt this big in 3 ways. Option 1, austerity, massive tax hikes, brutal spending cuts. Any politician proposing a 30% cut to Social Security commits political suicide. Option 2, outright default, simply refusing to pay. For the issuer of the world's reserve currency, this would collapse the global banking system overnight, which leaves only option 3, the quiet option, the polite option, the invisible option. The U.S. isn't refusing to pay its debt. It's paying every single dollar, just in money that's worth less than when it borrowed it. This is called a soft default. If inflation runs at 5%, the real value of the debt shrinks by 5% every year. On a $30 trillion debt load, that's $1.5 trillion erased in 1 year. No tax hikes, no votes, no headlines. The cost is silently transferred to savers. This is what economists call fiscal dominance. The debt is now so large that the Federal Reserve can't raise interest rates high enough to truly kill inflation. Because doing so would bankrupt the U.S. government, so the Fed tolerates higher inflation. Rates stay lower than they should. Inflation becomes policy. This strategy works through 3 modern tools. 1, captive buyers. Banks, pension funds, and insurance companies are forced by regulation to hold treasury bonds even when they lose value. 2, the CPI illusion. Inflation metrics are constantly redefined, keeping official inflation numbers lower than reality. 3, central bank backstopping. When foreign buyers step away, the Fed becomes the buyer of last resort, printing money to absorb the debt. The system stays liquid. The debt keeps growing. The currency absorbs the damage. This process fuels inequality. New money enters the financial system first. Asset owners benefit. Prices rise. Wages adjust later, after purchasing power is already gone. This is the Cantillon effect. And it explains why wealth concentrates during inflationary periods. So here's the truth. The United States is defaulting. Not loudly, not dramatically, slowly, politely, bureaucratically. The $36 to $38 trillion will never be paid back in real terms. The winners will be those who own scarce assets. The losers will be those who trust the currency. This is how America pays its debt, without paying it. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Because a slow default doesn't just reduce the value of government debt. It quietly rewires how the entire economy functions. When inflation becomes the tool and debt reduction becomes the priority, every other goal takes a back seat. Growth, productivity, long-term stability, they all become secondary. Why this strategy is chosen. The reason inflation is chosen over austerity or default is simple. It doesn't feel like a decision. There's no vote, no announcement, no crisis speech. Inflation spreads blame so thin that no single institution appears responsible. Prices rise, people adjust, life continues. Until suddenly, years later, people realize something fundamental has changed. Why debt can't be outgrown anymore. For decades, the argument was simple. As long as the economy grows faster than the debt, everything is fine. That used to be true, but that equation no longer works because economic growth is slowing while debt growth is accelerating. The U.S. economy grows at roughly 2% in real terms, but interest costs on the debt are growing far faster than that. This creates a fatal imbalance. The debt is no longer being outgrown, it's outpacing the economy itself. The interest rate trap. This leads to something called an interest rate trap. If rates go too low, inflation accelerates. If rates go too high, debt service explodes. So policy becomes trapped in the middle, where inflation is tolerated, and savers quietly pay the price. This is not a mistake. It is the least painful option politically. Why foreign buyers are stepping back for decades. Foreign countries helped finance U.S. debt. China, Japan, oil exporters, global central banks. They recycled dollars back into treasuries. But that system is cracking. Foreign ownership of U.S. debt is no longer rising the way it used to. Not because the U.S. is weak, but because inflation makes treasuries unattractive. Why lend money for 10 years if inflation guarantees a loss in purchasing power? As foreign demand weakens, the burden shifts inward. The domestic absorption phase. This is when the system turns inward. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, retirement accounts, they become the primary buyers of government debt. Not because it's attractive, but because regulation forces it. This is financial repression. Savings are quietly redirected to fund the state. Why this can last longer than people expect. Here's the mistake most people make. They assume this ends quickly. It doesn't. Slow defaults can last decades. Japan has been running a version of this system for over 30 years. High debt, low growth, financial repression, silent inflation. The US version is different only in scale and global impact. Why the dollar still holds. For now, many people ask, if this is happening, why hasn't the dollar collapsed? Because collapse isn't required. The dollar doesn't need to fail. It just needs to slowly lose purchasing power. A reserve currency can decline quietly as long as there's no alternative large enough to replace it. That's exactly what we're seeing. The psychology that makes this work. This system survives because of psychology. People anchor to nominal numbers. Their bank balance looks higher. Their paycheck grows. Their assets rise in price. But what matters is what that money buys. Inflation erodes purchasing power slowly enough that people adapt instead of revolt. Who is most exposed? This system punishes three groups the most. People on fixed incomes, people holding cash, people relying on savings instead of assets. It rewards leverage, scarcity, ownership. Not because it's fair, but because that's how inflation works. Why this isn't a conspiracy. This is important. This isn't a secret meeting or a shadow plan. It's structural. Once debt reaches this level, every system behaves the same way. And the math dictates the outcome. Why politics won't fix it. No political party can fix this. Raising taxes enough would collapse growth. Cutting spending would collapse trust. Defaulting would collapse the system. So inflation becomes the compromise. Not because it's good, but because it's survivable. What this means going forward. This doesn't mean immediate collapse. It means a new regime, one where inflation stays structurally higher, interest rates stay politically constrained, debt keeps rolling forward, purchasing power keeps eroding, slowly, relentlessly. The final reality. So when people ask, how will America pay $36 trillion in debt? The answer is now clear. It won't, at least not in real terms. It will pay it back with cheaper dollars over longer time frames through inflation. Closing. Keep calm, not fear. This isn't about panic. It's not about timing a crash. It's not about fear. It's about understanding the rules of the system you live in. Because once you understand how debt is actually paid, you stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically. That's the difference between being surprised by history and being prepared for it. But there's one more layer to this story that almost nobody talks about. Because inflation doesn't just reduce debt, it changes behavior across the entire system. When people realize that holding money is a losing strategy, they stop saving. They spend faster. They invest riskier. They borrow more aggressively. And this behavior feeds the very system causing the inflation. Inflation as a behavioral weapon. In an inflationary system, time becomes the enemy. Money today is worth more than money tomorrow. So rational behavior flips. Debt becomes attractive. Cash becomes toxic. Patience gets punished. This is how inflation quietly reshapes an economy's values. Why productivity stops mattering. In a healthy system, wealth comes from productivity. You create value, you save, you invest. But under financial repression, asset inflation matters more than output. Owning the right assets becomes more profitable than building things. This is why innovation slows even as markets rise. The hidden cost to the real economy. This is also why infrastructure decays, why public services feel stretched, why young generations feel locked out. The system isn't broken by incompetence, it's being sacrificed to service past debt. Future growth is traded for present stability. Why this can't be stopped easily. Once a country enters this phase, reversal becomes extremely difficult. Reducing inflation would require higher rates, lower asset prices, fiscal discipline, political pain. Every one of those is unpopular, so policymakers delay, and delay makes the problem larger. Why history always ends the same way. This isn't unique to the United States. Rome debased its currency. Post-war Britain inflated away debt. Weimar Germany lost control. Japan stagnated. Modern emerging markets repeat the cycle. Different systems, same math. Debt this large always seeks relief through currency. Why this time feels different, but isn't. Technology masks inflation. Automation lowers some costs. Globalization delays shortages. Digital finance hides monetary expansion. But technology doesn't cancel math. It only postpones consequences. What people misunderstand about collapse. Collapse isn't always chaos. Sometimes it's slow normalization, higher prices, lower expectations, shrinking purchasing power, permanent adjustment. People don't notice the fall. They adapt to it. The real divide. This system creates two classes, those who understand inflation and those who trust nominal numbers. One group positions, the other hopes. History is very clear about which group survives. Why this is a warning, not a prediction. This isn't saying the system collapses tomorrow. It's saying the rules have changed, and people still playing by the old rules will be the most confused when outcomes shift. What stays true? No matter what, currencies change. Systems evolve, governments rotate, but one rule never changes. Debt is always paid, if not directly, then indirectly, if not visibly, then silently. Final close. Strong, calm, authoritative. So when you hear, America can never default, the dollar is safe forever, debt doesn't matter. Remember this, the US is paying its debt, just not with checks, not with taxes, but with time, inflation, and purchasing power. And now that you understand how the system actually works, you won't be surprised by what comes next. You'll be prepared. There's one final consequence of this system that almost never gets discussed. Because inflation doesn't just change prices, it changes incentives. When governments learn that they can reduce debt by weakening the currency, they become addicted to it. Why make hard choices today when inflation quietly pushes the cost into the future? This is how temporary policy becomes permanent behavior. The trap of dependence. Once a system relies on inflation, it cannot easily return to discipline. Lower inflation means higher real interest rates, falling asset prices, budget stress, political backlash. So instead of fixing the problem, the system manages it. And management slowly replaces resolution. Why every solution makes it worse. Raising rates increases interest costs. Cutting spending triggers social unrest. Raising taxes slows growth. Default destroys trust. Every door is locked. So the system chooses the hallway. Slow devaluation. Not because it's ideal, but because it's survivable. How this ends in real life. This doesn't end with sirens. It ends with adjustment. People earn more nominally, but feel poorer. Savings grow, but buy less. Markets hit new highs, but life feels tighter. That's the signature of monetary decline. Why most people never notice? Because nothing breaks. There's no announcement, no reset button, no single moment to point to. The change happens in layers, year by year, cycle by cycle, until one day the old assumptions simply don't work anymore. The final shift. At some point, trust doesn't disappear. It relocates, away from promises, away from projections, away from nominal guarantees, and toward things that don't need belief. That shift is already underway. Final closing. Calm, strong. This isn't about fear. It's about understanding the environment you're in. The US isn't collapsing. It's adjusting. And adjustments always create winners and losers. And the difference isn't intelligence, it's awareness. Because once you understand how debt is really paid, you stop waiting for explanations and start reading the system itself. That's the real advantage. If this video helped you see the system more clearly, not through headlines, not through fear, but through structure, then you'll want to stay connected. On this channel, we don't chase predictions. We don't react to noise. We break down how money, power, and incentives actually work. Because once you understand the system, you stop being surprised by it. Subscribe to AEG currency, and I'll see you in the next one.